made a variety of forecasts, talking about the role of universities and so on and so forth. But at that point, I was working on the stability of complex societies, and so I decided to stick my neck out and make a forecast about the stability of the society in which I live, the United States, and also a little bit about Europe. So we published this forecast, and unfortunately, we are right on track. Even things are happening even a little bit faster than I expected. So what I'm going to do today is to talk to you about what was the basis of this forecast, and then we'll talk a bit more about the future directions of work. So the three major themes that I want to touch upon today are, first of all, what are the deep structural forces that drive instability in complex societies and result in waves of political violence. And I will use the United States over the last 50 years to illustrate major trends and mechanisms, and also that will give you some understanding of where that forecast came from. Secondly, I want to make the point that all the complex societies, all the state-level societies that have evolved about 5,000 years ago that we have studied, they all are susceptible to these periodic waves of political instability. So we'll talk about that. So our society apparently is not an exception to this rule. And finally, very briefly, as I said, I want to talk about what sort of work in progress and where can we take these research directions further on. So the theoretical basis for this work comes from, first and foremost, the work by Jack Goldstone, a historical sociologist currently at George Mason University, who wrote a really seminal book on revolution and rebellion in the early modern world, published in 1991. And in there, he focused on the period of 1500 to 1800, looking quite globally over Eurasia. So subsequently, work by other people, including myself and my Russian colleague Sergei Nefedov and several others, we have expanded the focus. And as I said, we showed that also this periodic waves of instability and also the periodic waves of instability affect all societies, and also the mechanisms that Jack identified as leading to such waves of instability, they seem to be quite general. So in secular cycles, for example, we looked at 8 examples of such as secular cycles involving stability waves, and looked into the details, and these were all for historical societies. But every time during the early 2000s, when I would give a talk about historical societies and their crisis, people almost invariably ask me, okay, where are we in the cycle? And so that basically prompted me to start working on applying this theory to United States. And of course, United States is a very different type of society from typical agrarian empires that we studied in the past. And the theory has to be modified accordingly. But it turns out that several major elements, several major mechanisms identified by Jack have actually been, we can show their operation in the present day complex societies. And specifically, we focus on 4 major drivers of social instability and political violence. These 4 result from looking at social societies as systems. So systems are defined as a collection of parts that are interacting dynamically with each other. So at a very macro level, we can think about social complex societies as consisting of 3 components. First of all, there are people, the population. And so one driver for instability comes from mass mobilization potential of the general population, which itself depends on the what may be called immiseration. So the decline, the stagnation, and even decline of living standards for the majority of population. So this is somewhat similar to the Malthusian component, but I want to emphasize that our theory does take Malthus in, but also takes Marx and Weber, but it is a synthetic theory. It's not a Malthusian theory in its pure form. So the second source of instability has to do with the elites, and I'll give you some more formal definition of that in a minute. And so we'll talk about the process of elite overproduction and leading to intra-elite competition and how that is a major source of instability. The third one is the state fragility. I will not talk much about that. I will focus on the first two just because I don't have enough time. And of course, societies don't exist in isolation. They are affected by geopolitical, geoeconomic, and also geocultural forces. But again, I won't have much time to talk about these two last things. I'll focus on the first two. So let's start with the first driver of instability, the effect of declining living standards for the majority of the population. So here are some data on real wages, so wages expressed in terms of its purchasing capacity for two classes of workers in the manufacturing and unskilled workers. And what we see is essentially a very similar dynamic. So there is a fairly rapid growth and with just a few fluctuations up until, roughly speaking, late 1970s, right? And then there is stagnation, and in fact, for unskilled labor, we see periods of declining wages. So what we seem to see here are two regimes. The fairly vigorous growth followed by stagnation and decline. So how can we understand this regime? One possibility is to think what happened in 1977, all right? But as we all know, complex dynamical systems can take linear inputs, but because of nonlinear interactions within systems, they can actually produce nonlinear outputs. So that's, in fact, the hypothesis that I want to explore here. And so I have done that with a very simple model in which wages at a particular year depend on that one-time step before, on GDP per capita, on the balance of labor demand versus supply, and on extra economic factors such as norms and institutions. So we can actually get pretty good proxies or direct measures for all of these variables. And so what we could do, we could use a regression model, which is basically by taking logs to see whether and how these different factors may help us explain this breaking point. And so what I'll do, I'll start building the model by adding one term at a time here. So here are the data, and this is the model, a very simple model where we are just looking at the per capita GDP. And so if you fit a model like that, then this is the prediction. It seems to capture this overall rise, but it doesn't really help us explain the breaking point. All right. Right, if you add demand-supply ratio, then we start seeing a more interesting effect. There are some now breakpoints, but still not quite, does not still give us a good explanation for this breaking point.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's a dynamical system. I mean, the wage at a certain time doesn't depend on the wage at the previous time at all.
No,
okay,
it's yeah. There is no autoregressive terms in this model.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So presumably, the assumption is that wage equilibrates rapidly enough, which is not quite true. It actually takes 4 or 5 years. But for this more macro look, I ignore the autoregressive terms. Okay. So the idea is that this factor sets some kind of an equilibrium thing, and the wage very rapidly approaches it. So finally, we include the third term here. And so let me just give you a bit more information about this. So what kind of proxy can be used for social norms and institutions? Basically, the idea here is that wages are set not only by economic forces such as demand, such as the balance of supply and demand, but also by cultural norms that influence what level of wages seems to be socially appropriate, and also how should the gains from economic growth be divided between the labor and capital, for example, right? And so what I did is that I proxied it by the real minimum wage. So the idea is that the minimum wage is set legislatively as a result of some kind of a discussion, public discussion, and that it results from the political process rather than economic process. And so if you simply put instead of culture here or institutions, you will just put the term or the real minimum wage, then suddenly this whole thing snaps into focus. So just the demand and supply of labor was not enough to give this this overall pattern. And then we can talk more about why this balance of supply and demand of labor changed during this period of time. You really need to understand the extra economic factors. All right, I'm rushing through this quite rapidly, but the details are in my book called Ages of Discord, which was published in 2016, just 2 months before Donald Trump won the elections. And so in that book, you will find the details, and I was happy to answer any questions. But I also look not on just, if we want to look at well-being, we don't want to limit ourselves to only economic well-being. We also want to look at other aspects of it. So for example, biological indices of well-being and also social indices of well-being, which are in the book. But let's look at the biological well-being. When I started in this project in early 2000s, I thought, as it turns out naively, in the retrospect, that malthus is dead. And so therefore, we should not see the, let's say, the biological effects of immiseration. You could see economic effects, maybe social, but biologically I thought that we are living in the post-Malthusian world. Unfortunately, the data has shown that this expectation was incorrect. Here I'll just show you 2 snapshots. So one of them is simply looking at the change in life expectancy of females in the United States over the 20-year period. And you notice that growth in life expectancy has a deep blue, and that's concentrated mostly along the coasts. The deep red actually indicates decline in life expectancy for women. And for men is a similar graph. I just don't show everything. So what we see here, we see this big swath of the so-called flyover country in the United States, in which on average life expectancy is declining. It may not come as a big surprise to realize that if you overlay the map of who voted for Republicans versus Democrats in the 2016 election, you would see quite a lot of match. So popular immiseration in the United States have taken fairly extreme form in which life expectancy has been declining. In fact, over the last 3 years, in 2 years, we had an average life expectancy for the whole United States declined slightly, which is something that...
Can I ask a question, or shall I reserve them for later?
Please do.
You had this regression thing, and then this exponents alpha, beta, gamma. So out of this fitting, you would have some values of these. And what do these values of this alpha, beta, gamma actually mean?
Yeah, what they mean is basically it is actually a very common model in economics, and the exponents give you relative importances of the different factors.
But I mean, can you actually explain these values? I mean,
no.
2 or 3 or...
They are fitted values, and so it's an empirical thing. It just basically tells you what
Essentially, those exponents are so if you do it in a price function, these value shares in. So if you do the labor and capital, then the alpha and the beta will be the value shares of labor and capital in GDP.
But I was really interested in seeing which factors you need to get there to get at that break point. And by the way, I just didn't say, but
if I use a different form of the function, then I will get different.
No, it's a phenomenological model. There are no real mechanisms here. We are just trying to use some quantitative relative measure of the importance of factors. Yeah. Just a minute. And so, actually, what I didn't expect that the model would actually even capture this this decline up to 1990 increase during the last decade of the 20th century, which is well attested, and then a decline again after 2000. Yes.
But would it be possible that the causality is actually reversed, and that the minimal wages are set because we saw that the wages are staying behind? The politics respond to certain groups staying behind in their wages, maybe
By lowering their wages.
Well, so I don't know what the correlation between the C factor and the data is, but it could be that you set that there's a political push to increase or reduce the minimum wage depending on the economic situation that you're in.
Yeah.
So then the causality could be the other way around, from wages staggering to setting new rules for minimum wages.
Yeah, so I would argue that yes, there is some of that feedback effect, and we have seen it really in the last 5 years or so, because the real wages have been declining, especially after the economic crisis of 2007-2008. But notice that it has not really done much. I mean, some places like Seattle, the state of Washington, has actually managed to increase its real wage, but at the level of the federal minimum wage, I wish I put that graph in for the real minimum wage. Then what you would see basically growth up to right around here, and then it just goes like this. And what's happening now hasn't even brought it way back to the level of 1970s. So to me, what I see it is that it's a result of the ideological shift in the way that labor capital relations are viewed in the United States. If after the Great Depression the social mood of the society, of American society, was that workers should get their fair share, which was basically built into the legislation during the New Deal's era. During the 1970s, all this framework built, and the New Deal has disintegrated gradually, and as a result of that, we see basically what we see. I probably don't want to talk too much about this. Again, in the book, I have the whole chapter talking about this, but it's very hard to condense the book-length story into 45 minutes. So I'm happy to talk about this more during the questions period. Anyway, so this is one thing. The other thing is that I've used for historical populations is the height. Average stature turns out to be a very sensitive indicator of biological ill-being slope, well-being for high stature and declining well-being for declines in stature. And again, when I started working on this project, I would not even expect that we would see such a Malthusian parameter. But here are the data. So we are looking at the height of men and women, and also is broken down by major race: white men and women, and black men and black women. So there's these 4 different graphs basically follow the average heights of native-born Americans plotted by the year of birth. And so what we see here, you see this increase up until the people who were born in 1970, and then there is either stagnation, or is in this case, this is the black women, there is an outright decrease. Their height has declined by 2 centimeters, which is actually an enormous amount. I mean, they lost like 40 years of progress by doing that. So if we look at the average of this curve, right? So here is the average of height, right? And let's see how well it correlates with real wages. But remember that we need to figure out what is the time, how we should shift the times. So there are 2 spurts of growth that humans experience. One is in the first 5 years, and the second one is the teenager spurt of growth. It turns out that if you shift these 2 scales by 15 years, so here we are looking at people who are born in 1955, they are 15 years in 1970, all right? So, this graph suggests that what's at play here is that how well economically do your parents, essentially. As you grow up and experience a second growth spurt, is overall economic situation good or not so good? And then we see quite a lot of, obviously, a great degree of parallelism. And so these 2, the major point here, again, is to show that these 2 different measures of well-being, they actually align, and they give us the same story, the growth of well-being up until mid-1970s, and then stagnation and decline. And this is important for the immiseration part.
You know Jan Luijten's paper on, he measured GDP, Jan Luijten van Zande measured GDP in the Netherlands by looking at the rate of recruits for the army.
And
exactly the same.
Yeah, because economic well-being has a direct effect on biological well-being. All right, but let's push with this story. Because I want to talk about the second important factor, which in many cases actually turns out to be even more important for understanding this crisis periods. So I use the neutral sociological definition of who the elites are. There's a small percentage, maybe 1–2% of the population, who concentrate social power in their hands, and I use Michael Mann's approach to social power. Remember, he talks about 4 sources of social power: coercion, economic power, administrative or political power, and ideological power. So the elites tend to concentrate these 4 sources of power in different countries. The different sources play different relative roles. In the United States, the most important source of power is economic, all right, because the wealthy 1% of the population controls not only the production, because they have the control of the capital, but also to a large degree they control the political component. So we can talk about this if you're interested. Certainly the military, the coercive component is thoroughly subordinated to the political component. So generals have no police chiefs. They have no effect, very slight effect on how the polity operates. And ideological power is heavily controlled by economic power because they own the major newspapers, so the media and other types of things. So for the United States specifically, we can focus on wealth holders. To the first approximation, that would be a good way to identify who are the elites and who are the commoners. All right, so what happens to the elites during this period of run-up to the crisis is that declining relative wages mean not only immiseration for most of the population, but also actually creates a very favorable economic conjuncture for those who consume labor, which is the economic elites, all right, and also elite aspirants. I'll talk about that part in a moment. So this is actually a general mechanism we see in historical societies, and with variations. Because in many historical societies, the elites were controlling not capital but land, right? But otherwise, the dynamic is very similar. So when we look back to golden ages of historical polities, these are typically golden ages for the elites, right? These are periods when the popular immiseration actually tends to increase. But of course, because most of the written sources we get from historical societies are written by elites or subscribed by them, we only get the favorable part of their story. All right. So what happens when the production when the elites get a larger share of the production? Well, first of all, the elite numbers and their appetites or expected level of consumption, they grow. Because it's very easy for humans to get used to good things, but it's very difficult for us to actually accept the declines of good things. Why are elite numbers growing? Well, partly in the historical societies, this would be partly biological, because the members of the elites would have more children. But more important is really upward social mobility. So it's in the 19th century United States, actually, this was a very clear effect. Again, at that time, as a result of massive immigration from Europe to the United States during the middle and second half of the 19th century, the price of labor was depressed. I'll show you long-term data in a minute. And what that meant was not only the existing capitalists actually did quite well economically, but skilled workers could start their own small businesses and hire labor cheaply, and then bootstrap themselves into the large employers. And so the influx of these new elites resulting from upward social mobility actually was the overwhelming mechanism for this process of elite overproduction. So let's talk about, look at some data for the more recent period. So what we see here is for the period between 1983 and 2007. So remember, the breakpoint is roughly speaking the late 1970s, 76, 77 or so. All right, so we are now looking at what are the effects of that breakpoint when the economy continued growing, fairly well. All right, and so all that extra economic growth ended up reaching the elites, and we see it here very graphically by looking at the percent of household with net worth exceeding 1 million, 5 million, or 10 million. Right, there's no hard breakpoint dividing the elites from non-elites, all right? So let's look at 3 different breakpoints. And basically you see the same thing. Over this period of time, the proportion of this household has doubled or even tripled or quadrupled. Right? And this is the proportion.
Very dangerous statistics.
What?
You see increasing GDP in the country, so GDP per capita is going up over this period. And so we know that the number of people who pass the thresholds increases rapidly then, even if there is no increase in inequality at all. So you're measuring inequality, but those are very dangerous numbers to measure them.
No, not really, because if we look at a longer time scale, like 200 years, for example, which I will do in a moment, we will see that the number of millionaires, for example, in 1900 dollars has actually declined between during the second quarter of the 20th century, and kept declining. So it declined between, roughly speaking, 19.
So that's the depression.
Not just depression; it went on for 50 years.
But I think the main point I want to make is you can make good numbers. This is a very tricky number. That's the same type of thing like if you shift the distribution of.
I understand the argument. I'm just saying that when we look at when you look over the long term, this is a good number because the effects of this structural forces overwhelms the statistical effect you're talking about. That's my answer.
But why do you not do, let's say, Piketty does all those things?
I'll show that.
Percentage.
Yes.
The percentage taken.
We'll take a look.
That I think it might.
We'll take a look at that. But here, what the point of this graph is to show that how numerically strong this effect was. We have over the period of just 25 years, one generation, we see the numbers of elites in proportion to the population increasing many-fold. I mean, this is a dramatic effect, which is not well captured by Piketty, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay? But what happens now? Let me just continue with this story. So what happens? So far, I mean, there is nothing terribly wrong with this graph. I mean, in principle, having more wealthy people means that at least those people are happier than they were 25 years ago. So what's the downside? Well, the downside is what we call the process of elite overproduction. So, and this is again a general mechanism we see in historical societies. So growing elite numbers and consumption levels eventually overshoot the productive base, which is the combined fruits of labor of the commoner population. And as this process continues to run away, all right, at some point the elite segment, so it's almost like a Malthusian type of a process now, except that there's no population overrunning its resource base. It's now the elites overrunning their resource base. And so now what we see as this process continues, then the more it goes on, the larger segments of elites actually start feeling themselves falling back and lacking the resources to maintain status. And of course, status is a movable target. During the golden age of the elites, it increases, right? And so it becomes, in many ways, unrealistic level to which to aspire. Nevertheless, the human nature is to aspire to such status. So since the number of power position is limited, both in the economy, but especially in politics, right? In the economy, we only have so many CEOs of Fortune 500, but in politics, it's really fixed. There's only one president, there's only so many justices in the Supreme Court, only 100 senators, and so on and so forth. So as the number of potential elite aspirants increases, the greater proportion of them must be denied access to it. So what we see here is essentially a very common process in the United States. People who acquire large wealth in the first generation, in the second generation, they aspire to political office themselves, or they use their wealth to support candidates. So much of this new wealth is actually translated into political sphere. All right, and so the competition for that becomes very acute. And so this, when we see the rise of counter elites, these are the surplus elites who have been frustrated in their desire to get, let's say, status positions, and some of them turn to challenging the existing order, perhaps even using violent means. So the violence typically comes later in the cycle. So this is just a caricature, the process that connects elite overproduction to social and political instability. Okay, and so we see this with numbers. So for example, here is the number of candidates, including primaries, obviously, for both House and Senate. All right, and then how many of them are so-called millionaires, which is the way it's detected in this particular data case, is people who have spent $500,000 of their own money for running for office, assuming that they probably would not spend more than half of their total wealth. That means that they're at least millionaires and probably much more wealthier. And so what we see here is that we start with about the doubling of this. It fluctuates, but you have more and more wealthy people running for office themselves. So Trump obviously is an example, but not the only one. Bloomberg is another example. There are many actually examples of such. Obviously, I'm not talking about just Senate and House. I'm talking about Bloomberg was the mayor of New York, and Trump obviously became the president of the United States. But these are not exceptions. We see many, many more wealthy people running for office, or like Brothers Koch, spending a lot of money to run their candidates for things that they want to support. And so as a result of that, the cost of winning in inflation-adjusted dollars has been rising quite rapidly, doubling up, in fact, over this period of about 30 years. All right. So, so we see this. This is an example of how we can actually obtain proxies for intra-elite competition, which in this case takes the competition for a fixed number of offices. Because yes, so let me just conclude part 2 by basically saying that the two major structural trends that undermine social and political stability in the US over the last which have developed over the last 50 years. It's a long-term process. Are, first of all, declining well-being or immiseration of large segments of the American population, and that drives mass mobilization potential. And secondly, elite overproduction, which increases the inter-elite competition and conflict. All right, so much shorter second part is just to situate this in a more historical setting. So, first of all, as I promised, let's look at what has happened with the United States over the last 200 years. Now, this is a bit tricky because the United States has changed dramatically over this period. So, for example, we see it here in GDP per capita over the last 230 years. So, this is the nominal real wage, and this is this is GDP per capita in 2005 dollars, and this is real wage, right? Also expressed in the same 2005 dollars. But by the way, since the denominator is the same in both of these graphs, we could just take nominal GDP and divide it by nominal real wage. But here I'm doing it for real wages. So let's divide this by that. Why am I doing this? Well, I want to get some understanding of how much of the fruits of economic growth. So here's this is the mean production, but how much of that is actually get some kind of a typical worker. All right. So this could be a median. So median to mean is often a way to measure inequality, because mean here is inflated by, let's say, upper 1%. but here we are looking at just the typical wage. So when we divide this graph by that, we get this essentially. So this is very interesting because we see actually one period of increase in relative wage, so I call it relative wage, wage divided by GDP per capita, then a period of decline and stagnation, another period of increase. So this is the one we have been looking at actually. And here we are now in the opposite trend of this graph. So we see actually two cycles, and so this is why I proposed in that Ages of Discord that we are living in the middle of the second great secular cycle. And now you asked for the PKT type numbers. So here, unfortunately for that, we only have data from 1914 or so. Okay. So here is the income inequality, and the broken line is the wealth inequality. So this part from 1910 to 2010 is only the second cycle that we see here. But in fact, the United States has experienced a very similar cycle before, and in fact for the past historical societies for which you have data, we see again the same type of long-term waves. They tend to be a little longer than the United States, typically about 200 years in period. All right. Okay, so here again, I'm just running quickly through a whole bunch of summarizing a whole bunch of data. So this is a summary of well-being indicators. Relative wage that I showed you is the green line, but there is also health, which summarizes longevity and height. There is a social measure of well-being. The most important point is that there is a lot of disagreement between those things in detail, but overall they trace these two cycles, and the gray part is the principal component one, which sort of tells us what's happening overall. And I don't have time to talk about the various proxies that go into the elite overproduction, but there is a bunch of them here, so we can again summarize them with the PC one component. And when we put the popular well-being PC1 and the elite overproduction PC1, you basically get the mirror images of these two things. So basically, the pendulum swings back and forth between these two subcomponents, between these two components of the social system. And when we put data on political violence in the United States, which includes a variety of things, the riots, lynchings, terrorism, right? So the black line is the overall thing per 5 years. Then we see quite a strong effect. So, for example, here we are looking at the structural demographic pressure is essentially taking both of these things into consideration. And here is the political violence. There is a pretty strong correlation. What we see here, we see this long one cycle of violence, and then now we are in the rise of the second one. But the picture is complicated by these 50-year spikes overlaid on it, which is a bit of a separate story I have to talk about later. But this is, so during this period of time, so between 1780 and 1820, right? We see actually, it's kind of hard to see. You see the trends of collective intrastate violence have been declining. Then big increase, another big huge decline to the 1950s. Now we are in the increasing part of it.
Is there an intuitive explanation for over 100-year cycle, or this is just happenstance?
No, there is not intuitive. The explanation is actually based on this structural demographic trends I was talking about. So maybe let's come back to this in a minute. Right, so here is just a point to show that if you look at the long-term data, like in France, for example, or in Rome, you see these waves of instability, right, which historians have given names, in fact. and interspersed by periods of relatively low instability. So again, it's a 2-3 century intervals that are not, it's not perfect periodicity, obviously, but we do have this shifts between integrated periods when the states are strong, the population is doing reasonably well, and there is low internal instability, and disintegrated periods when this instability fluctuates. And by the way, this is a 50-year spike you see here too. It's actually a generic feature.
What is Turchin's index? What does it use?
This is basically, it comes from Turchin. It's looking at the number of instability events, such as rebellions, military rebellions, peasant rebellions, and things like that. But there is a numerical scheme which assigns sort of importance to them. So a major rebellion would have more of will affect this index more than than another one. So if you look at well-being for periods when we have actually we can measure it using things like wages or heights. We see this, this fluctuation. So here we are in the United States with these two things. And when you overlay periods of protracted civil wars, you essentially see a close correlation between them and this waves of instability. So the major point from these previous two slides is that, as I said, I can show you the data for all the polities that we have studied because there are just too many. These are just examples, but to take my word for it, for any historical society for which you have reasonable quantitative data, they all go through this long waves of a couple hundred years. Right, so Walter Scheidel has already been mentioned today. So he has, of course, a very popular book, The Great Leveler, and the major conclusion that he comes is that death is the great leveler. So death is what declines, what can decrease inequality. And the death comes in a variety of guises. It could be mass mobilization warfare, transformative revolution, state failure, collapse, and lethal pandemics. All right. So I actually don't necessarily see inequality as it's not a driving factor in my model. It is more of a surface indicator of what the structural processes. All right. And also I tend to be a bit more optimistic than Walter, but not a huge amount of more pessimistic, optimistic. I'll show you what I mean. So what so far from historical data we have determined is entry into the crisis is relatively stereotypical. You have this mass mobilization, intra-conflict, and state fragility. So these are your mechanisms. These are your mechanisms. These actual mechanisms that drive the cycles. I don't have time to show you the formal model, but the formal model is in Ages of Discord, if you are interested.
I'm also wondering immediately about the social norms that come into play. The guardrails which can affect.
Yes, and that's also again that's part of the story in the book. Yeah. All right. So this part is actually fairly stereotypical, but the exit from crisis seems to be much more contingent. It looks like using this leaf here, everybody enters into the crisis. There is one channel, but then there is very huge sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which can result in both the positive and negative ways of exiting the crisis. So if we actually, wait a second, what happened? Oops, okay, yeah, for some reason, some slides got out of order. So if we actually, for 30 well-studied cases which we have accumulated over the past 20 years, if we look at, if we just score the severity of components using fairly crude scheme, basically assigning yes or no, is there population decline, is it very dramatic population decline, and so on and so forth. All right, then you get a scale from 0 to 9. And so essentially what it turns out is that in 15% of cases it's pretty mild. There is a small peak here, maybe just statistical fluctuations, or at least it could be just a tail. In majority of cases you have quite severe outcomes, and sometimes you have really things going to hell in the basket. So unfortunately it's not really symmetric, it's lopsided. And this is what I mean, that I'm more optimistic than water. So water is 85% correct. But there is still 5 to 10 to maybe 15% probability. We know actually for these 3 cases, we have studied them quite carefully, so we have some good idea how the societies managed to go through the crisis without major problems. So this obviously gives us hope that maybe we can learn to do it.
Just curious if you can compare this with the frequency of major earthquakes in earthquakes.
Earthquakes. I have not done that.
Explain your question.
Well, I mean, the stresses in the Earth system, they keep increasing until the point it...
You mean, oh yes, as an analogy.
Richter scale, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I use this precisely as an analogy. The earthquake are work at 2 levels. First of all, these long-term patterns, the long-term trends that I was talking about, you can think about them as pressures. So in earthquakes are a result of one plate, different plate impinging on the other, so the pressure keeps growing, right? And then you need a triggering effect. And so there's constantly some triggering effects down the 2 kilometers down, but most of them, it's like a sand pile model, right? They don't expand. But then at one point, one particular stress will result in this expanding thing, and then you have a major earthquake. So our model of political outbreaks of political violence is very similar. We can predict that the pressure is growing, but precisely when things will crunch, you cannot tell, because this system is very sensitive to these tiny perturbations, most of whom don't grow. Okay.
Well, it might be troublesome for the predictability of a major earthquake, but it might be able to get some tail distribution if you compare.
Let's save this because I'm almost done. So basically, here's the sort of a caricature explaining this. So here's the social pressure of for crisis, and this is, let's say, our utility function or the outcome is the collective well-being. And so collective well-being starts to decline as a result of these pressures. But then some kind of rupture happens, earthquake, if you wish, social quake, if you wish. And what's the point that I'm making is looking at those 30 case studies, and more generally, but less quantitatively, and the rest of them, yes, in the majority of cases you have quite bad declines of well-being, right, before it may come out. But sometimes you see mild declines leading to recovery. So one interesting question is to determine what really happens at the cusp here, and what kind of intervention could push trajectory in more favorable or less favorable.
Can you give?
Yeah, let me just finish because and then you'll go to questions. So just 3 more slides. So basically, we know that predicting social unrest is very difficult. This article, for example, has quantified how nobody could predict the Arab Spring. All right, so what is our current work by my group is to try to use multi-path forecasting, similar to how weather, how hurricanes are predicted in many ways. So we use the empirically ground historical analysis and collect a massive database, which has not been done yet. So we need to expand from our 30 case studies to 300 because again, because it's so hard to get results for hugely contingent and processes. We need a lot of data for that. So and also we integrate qualitative data. So here's the culture. And also things like collective emotions, which turned out to be very important triggers when all these come in. and then translate between these macroprocesses in microdynamics using a multi-level modeling approach in which we both model micro level and then see how it can be aggregated into the macro level. And then basically trying to come up with an engine that, here it is. Yes, sorry. For some reason this slide has migrated back. Yes, okay, this is the one. So the idea is basically to use a computational social engine which would run you a variety of trajectories and try to predict not really where the the trajectory is going to end up with, but rather the ensemble of these trajectories. So as has happened, for example, with the Hurricane Sandy. And the idea is that here are some tracks of historical hurricanes. So our idea is to collect these tracks for historical societies, as many of them as possible, and not really use it for in a statistical way, but actually build a series of mechanism-based models that would be informed by this historical data, and hopefully that would give us some idea about what's predictable and how it was not predictable and where are the limits of unpredictability. So yes, so thank you very much.